Hmm. Oh, hello there. Are you ready for tonight's bedtime story? Brilliant. Tonight's bedtime story is called Mr. Uppity. It is written by Roger Hargreaves with pictures by Adam Hargreaves. This is the story of Mr. Uppity, and how Mr. Uppity finishes the story. Not quite so uppity as at the beginning of the story. You see, Mr. Uppity was one of the rudest people in the world, if not the rudest. He was rude to anybody and everybody. So, of course, in Big Town, which was where he lived, he had no friends at all. No one. Miserable old Uppity, they used to call him, and he certainly looked it. Now, as well as being rude, Mr. Uppity was also rich. Very rich. One of the richest people in the world, if not the richest. He had the largest, longest limousine in Big Town. He had the largest, longest garden in Big Town. He had, on top of a hill, in the middle of Big Town, the most enormous house. The biggest house in Big Town. And there he lived, all alone. Miserable old Uppity. One day, Mr. Uppity was walking in the gardens of his enormous house, when suddenly he heard a voice. A little voice. "Hello," said the voice. Mr. Uppity looked, and there, in one of his hundreds of flower beds, was a goblin. "Aren't you going to say hello to me?" asked the goblin. "Go away," said Mr. Uppity rudely. I know you. Oh, I know who you must be," said the goblin. "You must be Mr. Uppity, who's rude to everybody." Sniffed Mr. Uppity rudely. "Well, I know somebody who wants to meet you," said the goblin, and skipped off, the way goblins do. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. Mr. Uppity's curiosity got the better of him. He followed. "In there," said the goblin, pointing at a small hole in the tree. "Don't be silly," snorted Mr. Uppity. "Oh, I'm not being silly," said the goblin. "Yes, you are," snapped Mr. Uppity. "I can't possibly get in there." "Aha!" smiled the goblin, and then he said a magic word only known for goblins, which sounded like this: wobbly, gobbly, gook, or something like that. Suddenly, Mr. Uppity started shrinking. He shrank and he shrank until he was the exact same. He shrank and he shrank until he was exactly the same size as the goblin. "Turn me back to my proper size, at once," spluttered Mr. Uppity with a rage. "Shan't," grinned the goblin. And so saying, the goblin climbed through the hole into the tree. Poor Mr. Uppity didn't know what to do, so he followed him. Inside the tree, there was a staircase going down and down. Do you know where it led to? It led directly to the kingdom of the goblins. That's where. "I demand to be taken immediately to whoever is in charge," said Mr. Uppity angrily. "Oh, you shall, grinned the goblin. And he led Mr. Uppity through the streets of the kingdom of the goblins until they came to a palace. "Halt! Who goes there?" cried the goblin sentry at the gate. "I have brought Mr. Uppity," said the goblin. "Oh," said the sentry, and smiled. The goblin and Mr. Uppity passed through the gates and into a courtyard, and through some more gates, and along a long corridor, and through some large gold doors, and into a huge room. There, sitting on a gold throne, was the king of the goblins. "Your Majesty," announced the goblin, bowing low, "may I present Mr. Appetite?" "Aha!" smiled the king. "So you're the fellow that goes about being rude to everybody and doesn't have any friends." "Nonsense," said Mr. Appetite rudely. I could see that what I've heard is true," said the king, looking at the indignant Mr. Appetite. "You're much too puffed up with your own importance. Therefore," he continued, "I am going to allow you to return back to your proper size. But when you get back to Big Town, if you're rude to anybody at all, you will be immediately shrink to the size you are now. Do you understand?" The goblins then took Mr. Appetite back through the kingdom of the goblins, and up the staircase, and out of the tree at the bottom of Mr. Appetite's gardens. The goblin looked at Mr. Appetite and said something which sounded like "Koogly, boogly, boo," or something which is probably wobbly, gobbly, gook, said backwards, and Mr. Appetite grew and grew back to his original size. "Now you remember what the king said," warned the goblin. "Don't be so uppity in the future." Mr. Appetite marched off furiously to his enormous house. The following day, Mr. Appetite was out walking through the streets of Big Town. Suddenly, he came across a little boy playing with a ball. "Get out of my way," snapped Mr. Appetite rudely. But as soon as he said it, "Do you know what happened, don't you?" Yes, that's right. Mr. Appetite shrank and shrank until he was no bigger than the ball the boy was playing with. "Oh dear," he gasped, and then he thought. "I'm sorry," he said to the boy. "What I meant to say was, please could I get past?" Immediately, Mr. Appetite grew to his original size, and the boy moved, and Mr. Appetite went on his way. Then he met an old lady carrying a large shopping basket. She was late for market. "Excuse me," she said to Mr. Appetite. "Could you tell me the time, please?" "No," said Mr. Appetite rudely. But as soon as he said it, you know what happened, don't you? Yes. Mr. Appetite shrank and shrank until he could easily have fitted into the old lady's basket. "Oh dear," he gasped, and then he thought. "I'm sorry," he said to the old lady. "What I meant to say was, it's 25 past 11. Immediately, Mr. Appetite grew to his original size, and the old lady thanked him, and Mr. Appetite went on his way. Then he went out and brought a newspaper from a man standing on the corner of Big Town. He was just about to walk away when suddenly he stopped and thought. He turned back to the man and said, "Thank you." "Thank you" were two words Mr. Appetite had never used before. The man smiled. A smile was something Mr. Appetite wasn't used to getting. Then Mr. Appetite was stopped by a man who asked him if he could tell him the way to the bank. Mr. Appetite was just about to say no when he thought. "Yes," he said, and told the man. "Thank you," he said the man. "Thank you" were words that Mr. Appetite was not only had never used before, but were words that he had never had said to him before. Mr. Appetite smiled. He felt happy. Happy was a feeling Mr. Uppity wasn't used to feeling. He liked it. And do you know, from that day forward to this day, backward, Mr. Uppity is a changed person. He's still the richest person in Big Town, perhaps the richest person in the world, but now he has lots of friends, and he smiles a lot, and he never gets that shrinking feeling. And do you know which words Mr. Uppity uses most of all these days? You should know by now. Please and thank you. So, what we'd like to say is, thank you for reading the story. And if you're ever thinking about being rude to somebody, please keep a sharp lookout for goblins. What a fun story called Mr. Uppity. It's time for you to go to bed. But until then, see you soon for another bedtime story. Bye.